Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's so great to see everyone here. Nice turnout. My name is Deirdre Gonzalez-Jackson, and I'm the Provost and Vice President. So I'm happy to be here representing Academic Affairs. So welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Robert Nusbaum Center's annual Justine L. Nusbaum Endowed Lecture. This lectureship was established by Justine's sons, Robert Nusbaum, namesake of the center, and Ph.D. Nusbaum, in honor of their mother for her lifelong generosity and commitment to service and community. Born in Norfolk in 1900, Justine began volunteering with the American Red Cross at just 17 years old, launching more than 80 years of uninterrupted service, which included assisting immigrants and refugees from conflicts across the globe. This annual lectureship carries forward her legacy. We are honored to welcome members of the Nusbaum family with us today, Bill and Sharon Nusbaum. Thank you for being here. Bill is the son of Robert C. Nusbaum, the center's namesake, and the grandson of Justine Nusbaum. And we're very happy that they could join us today. It is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Craig Wansey, who serves as the Joan P. and Macon F. Brock Jr. Director of the Robert Nusbaum Center, to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. We are so glad that Dr. Brad Stoddard flew down yesterday, joining us from McDaniel College in Westminster, Maryland. I could just say that his research focuses on religion and drugs and religion in American prisons and religion in public society. And that is why he's here, in part because the series this semester focuses on freedom in light of the 250-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So focusing some today on how the First Amendment affects us. But Dr. Stoddard has also worked in mortgages for many years. He served an expert witness in court cases relating to ayahuasca many years ago. He was in a punk rock band that opened for Green Day. So he's fascinating enough that his students are likely missing him today, but we are glad that he is here. Thanks for joining us.
Hey everybody, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good? Okay, cool. First, I want to thank the Nusbaum family for their continued support, creating a place where we can have these important conversations. I'd like to thank the faculty and the staff and the administration involved with the Nusbaum Center for inviting me here, bringing me here today to share this afternoon with you, and I'd like to thank each of you for coming. And I've already had to answer this a few times, so sorry to disappoint those who are here for the wrong reasons. There will be no samples provided today. It is what it is. Feel free to leave. You don't have to stay. It's fine. I'm going to talk to you about drugs, and I'm going to talk to you about psychedelic churches, if that's okay. But I want to make it pretty clear that that's not really what I'm most interested in. What I'm most interested in is this concept of religious freedom, and in questioning some of the things that we are commonly taught about religious freedom. We are commonly taught that religious freedom is good. We're commonly taught that religious freedom is possible. We are commonly taught that the laws designed to empower religious freedom actually do that, and I'm going to question most of that today. So to do that, I'm going to talk to you about drugs. So for the last 9 years, I've been researching psychedelic churches, and I forget what most people are aware of. So just show of hands, I'm curious, how many of you are aware that there are psychedelic churches in the country? Actually a minority. Okay, cool, thank you. So when we think of psychedelics, most of us probably think of the 1960s. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, tune in, turn on, drop out, the hippie movement, the counterculture movement. When most of us think about drugs, or at least maybe not your generation, but prior to your generation, when most of us think about drugs, primarily psychedelics, we probably think of the 1960s. And what we don't tend to think about is that we are roughly 20 years into the return of psychedelics that is referred to as the psychedelic renaissance. Simply put, psychedelics are back and probably bigger than ever. And there are various corners or aspects of this returning interest in psychedelics. One aspect of the psychedelic renaissance is that large corporations, big pharma, they're investing billions of dollars into psychedelic research. Why? Because they're looking for the next big thing in mental health. They believe that psychedelics might be able to help us recover from PTSD, recover from mental health issues, et cetera, et cetera. So Big Pharma is investing billions of dollars. This is one aspect in research. This is one aspect of the psychedelic renaissance. Relatedly, universities are stepping up. And not just little universities. Big universities across the world are stepping up to research psychedelics for pretty much the same reason that large corporations are researching psychedelics. Just one aspect of the psychedelic renaissance. There's a cancer hospital about a half hour from where I live that they created an entire wing of their hospital where they give psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, to people who have been diagnosed with cancer, to help them confront their cancer, their imminent mortality. Another component of the psychedelic renaissance is the decriminalized nature movement. Several dozen cities and counties in the United States have effectively decriminalized the possession of certain plant-based psychedelics. So you're pulled over by the police, you're searched, you have a couple grams of mushrooms on you, they just let you go. And so this has happened in, I think the number is somewhere around 35 cities and counties have decriminalized some plant-based psychedelics. 2 states, Colorado and Oregon, have in their own ways legalized certain plant-based psychedelics. And so collectively, these things that I've discussed they comprise collectively the psychedelic renaissance with one important additional component, and that's the component of psychedelic churches, psychedelic religion. So as the broader interest in psychedelics is growing, many people, I think it's an objective fact, more Americans today are consuming psychedelics for religious and spiritual reasons than at any point in human history. We're talking about tens of thousands of people. When they take psychedelics, they claim to encounter God. That's not always a term they use. Some of the people I study, they have an aversion to that word, so they'll say, I encountered source, I encountered divinity, I encountered that which is the creator of everything. Sometimes they call it God, they have other names for it. When they take psychedelics, they claim to encounter ancestors. They claim to encounter all hosts of divine, supernatural beings. They claim to access realms of existence that are more real, they say, than the realm of this temporary existence. Also, they claim supernatural healing, and equally important, the people that I study that claim to take psychedelics for religious or spiritual reasons, they say when I came back from those other realms where I encountered God, I acquired knowledge. And it's the kind of knowledge that we normally associate with religion. Answers about life's ultimate purpose. What is the nature of God? What is the fate of my soul? The reality of my soul? Etc., etc. And so some of us in this audience, maybe most of us, will say, I mean, come on, let's be real. These are psychedelic drugs. They're having hallucinations. None of this is real. That may or may not be the case. Not my job to judge. What I am fully convinced of is that the people that I study are convinced that they are having objectively real religious and spiritual experiences. And they're aware that they're going to have some haters and some doubters. And so to make sure that they distinguish the religious or spiritual use of psychedelics from the recreational use of psychedelics, they're increasingly embracing a new term, a semi-new term. The term is entheogen. And an entheogen, they argue, is a psychoactive or psychedelic substance that is taken for religious or spiritual purposes. They would argue if I'm taking magic mushrooms, I would assume we're all familiar with magic mushrooms, at least conceptually. They say if I'm taking magic mushrooms at a rave, I'm taking a psychedelic. If I'm going to a religious ceremony to take psychedelic mushrooms, I'm taking an entheogen at an entheogenic ceremony. And so they're embracing this word to describe their religious sacrament, as they would call it. So if these people are increasingly taking psychedelics as part of their religion, under what circumstances are they consuming this? Broadly speaking, I've documented 3 different types of approaches to consuming entheogens. One model of consuming entheogens is what I'm calling the contract facilitator. The contract facilitator is someone who just announces to their community, hey, I'm holding some ceremony, an ayahuasca ceremony. If you don't know what that is, we're going to talk a lot about it. Give me about 10 minutes. We're having an ayahuasca ceremony or a mushroom ceremony or one of these other psychedelics. And if you want to attend it, you pay me, you can come, and that's the end of our relationship. There's no community based necessarily with contract facilitators. It's very much a pay-as-you-go model. And so I have this model right here. So you can see on February 27th, These are actual ceremonies. I've cut out the person that's offering these ceremonies, but these are real ceremonies. If you know the person who posted this, you can go attend a combo ceremony in Maryville, Virginia for $200 on February 27th. Combo is a frog secretion. You burn it kind of into your skin, and it's a purgative. And so when people do combo and they purge, they're not like purging breakfast. Their argument is that they're purging trauma, they're purging harm, mental health problems, et cetera, et cetera. The very next day, they're having an ayahuasca and a combo ceremony. So I don't want to get hung up on this slide, but you can see this is the contract facilitator model. You pay someone, you go, you do the substance, you leave, and that's the extent of it. There are also, however, informal groups. And when I say informal groups, there's no structural hierarchy to these people. They don't file any paperwork claiming that they're a church. It's usually just an extended friend group. And there are many, many, many of these. One not too far from where I work, a former vet who's retired. They're old school hippies, and they have this extended network. Well, they'll just text their friends, hey, we're going to have a mushroom ceremony the following Saturday. Come on over if you want. And so there is an extended community in the sense that they're like-minded friends that continue to get together, hang out and whatnot. But a third category of psychedelic or entheogenic consumption is churches. And these are what I'm really interested in studying, and it's mostly what I'm going to talk to you about. When I say that these are churches, these are formal institutional churches. And there are two components to these churches that I want to talk to you about. One component is that they are legal churches in the sense that they have completed the paperwork with their state, registering them as a church. And quite literally, that's all it takes to create a church. By the end of this day, you all could go home, you complete the paperwork, you submit it online in Maryland, you write a $175 check, and within a week, you're going to be the founder of your own church. It's quite literally that easy. And you can, this will become important, so just file this in your mind, you can approach the federal government via the IRS for additional recognition as a church, but that's not necessary. So these churches that I study are legal churches in the sense that they've completed the paperwork. They've told the government, their state government, we're a church, here are our ministers, here's our statement of beliefs, etc., etc. So just because they are legal churches, does that mean they automatically get the right to use psychedelic substances? Absolutely not. Filing the paperwork to be recognized by your state does not mean that you have a right as a church to just do anything you want. Filing the paperwork with your state means that the state recognizes you as a religion. However, theoretically we're talking, if you want to legally serve otherwise psychedelic substances, if your church wants to engage in behavior that society or that the federal government says is illegal, there is an additional important step. And that requires getting an exemption from what is called the Controlled Substances Act. In 1970, the federal government passed the Controlled Substances Act, which created illegal drugs as we know it. We know this drugs used to be legal, and not that they were all criminalized in 1970, but 1970 created the structure of drug laws as they exist today. And so if you're a church that wants to legally consume psychedelics or otherwise illegal substances, you have to go to the government and you have to say, look, we're already recognized as a church because of the First Amendment, because of additional legislation called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. We're not going to go down there and get too geeky, go too much in the weeds for that. But because of all this legislation supporting religious freedom, we deserve the right to do something that the rest of society can't. So the churches that I study have across the board completed the first step. They filed the paperwork with their state. The question remains, have any of them got that exemption from the government, making them fully legal? I'm going to answer that later in the lecture, but I am curious, show of hands, just a few people. How many psychedelics, so most of you didn't even know they existed. So a few people, how many psychedelic churches would you guess there are in the country today? Nusbaum family. I'm going to put you on the spot. 20. Good guess. Very wrong. Great guess.
I would have said a couple thousand.
Okay, very wrong. Somewhere in between those two. Joking aside, we've documented somewhere between 250 and 550 psychedelic churches. And these include cannabis churches. So, from the perspective of thousands, not many. But it's a heck of a lot more than there ever have been. The fact of the matter is there are more psychedelic churches in the United States than there ever have been by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And so, again, the question is, are any of them fully legal? To answer that question, we've got to leave the United States. To answer that question, we've got to go down to South America. We have to go to the Amazon rainforest. Why? Because in the Amazon rainforest, some indigenous tribes have consumed a substance that has many names. The most common name is ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is simultaneously a vine and a drink. It is a psychedelic drink when brewed the correct way. And so ayahuasca goes by many names. There are an infinite number of recipes, an infinite number of ways to make ayahuasca. But all versions of ayahuasca have two things in common. One, they have the ayahuasca vine, and that's what ayahuasca is. This is the ayahuasca vine. I'm going to say why that vine is important in a minute. But the second ingredient that is always in the ayahuasca drink is one of two leaves. The most common leaf is the trachuna leaf, which I have here behind me on my left. The trachuna leaf is important because it contains something called DMT or dimethyltryptamine. Dimethyltryptamine is a naturally occurring substance. Every single one of us are carrying DMT in our brains. Dimethyltryptamine occurs in nature. It is also in the United States an illegal psychedelic drug. So the trachuna leaf is important, not just because it contains DMT. Quite a few plants contain DMT. The trachuna leaf is important because it contains a heck of a lot of DMT. And so there are different ways that you can consume DMT. You can synthesize it and inject it. There are plants that can be ground up and you can snort it. You can smoke DMT. But when you mix the trachuna leaf with the ayahuasca vine, you get ayahuasca the drink. So why do we need these two, this vine and this leaf? You could take a whole bunch of trachuna leaves, boil it in some water, strain the leaves, and you're going to have a whole pitcher full of DMT-rich drink. And you could drink the whole thing, and you probably wouldn't feel anything except sick from having a gallon or so of plant juice in your stomach. Why? Because our stomachs contain an enzyme that eats the DMT before it's able to get into our blood. And this is where the ayahuasca vine becomes important. The ayahuasca vine contains something called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, an MAOI. What the ayahuasca vine does, when you boil the trachuna leaf with the ayahuasca vine, what happens is the DMT gets leached from the leaf into the ayahuasca drink, and the ayahuasca vine contributes the MAOI. So when you drink the ayahuasca drink, the MAOI alters your stomach's chemistry, allowing your body to absorb the DMT. So if you inject DMT, if you smoke DMT, if you snort DMT, you get about a 15-minute entheogenic experience or psychedelic experience. When you drink ayahuasca, buckle up, 4 to 7 hours, because it's leaching slowly through your stomach into your bloodline, into your bloodstream. And so DMT, ayahuasca, can produce, or it does produce an altered state. And when people drink ayahuasca, they report all the things that I said earlier that the people I study associate with psychedelic religion. Gods, realms, entities, truth, healing, etc., etc. But there's one more important thing that we need to know that's going to become important in a few minutes here. When people drink ayahuasca, they very, very commonly report that they encounter a feminine spirit. And they argue that that feminine spirit is the feminine spirit of ayahuasca. And so people take all kinds of psychedelics, they encounter all sorts of beings, allegedly entities. But when people drink ayahuasca, they repeatedly say, I encountered Mother Ayahuasca. I encountered the spirit of ayahuasca. And she was beautiful, and she was love, and she was all these things. Just file that feminine spirit in your mind, because she's going to become important. So what is the history of ayahuasca? Indigenous people, some indigenous people, will tell you they've consumed it for thousands of years. The archaeological record suggests closer to 500 years. Not important. What is important is that it has been consumed for a while. And there are two things that we need to note about the traditional consumption of ayahuasca. And these two things are very important. The first thing we need to note about the traditional consumption of ayahuasca prior to the last 100 or so years is that it was done outside the confines of what we would consider institutional religion. There was no Church of Ayahuasca. There was no statement of beliefs like you would find in a church. There's no Sunday schools for indoctrination about teachings about ayahuasca. It was more of a sociocultural phenomenon that is predicated on what we would call religiosity. The other thing we need to note about the traditional consumption of ayahuasca is that it was consumed primarily by what they would call a curandero or a curandera. The word that we typically use is shaman. And since so many Westerners are going to South America now saying we're here for the shamanic ayahuasca experience, the curanderos and curanderas have adopted the word shaman, so they now call themselves shamans. It's not an indigenous term, but for the sake of communicating with us all, I'm going to use the word shaman. So traditionally, again, prior to the last 100 or so years, if you were sick, you would go to the shaman and you would say, I'm sick, will you heal me? The shaman would say, sure, sit down. The shaman would drink ayahuasca. The shaman would allegedly enter the spirit world, diagnose your illness, use their shamanic powers to cure you. They would come back from the spirit world and pronounce that you are cured. And so the important thing to note here is that the person consuming the ayahuasca is not kind of the average person. It's the person that is specially trained to consume ayahuasca. So during the colonial period, this seems to have been the norm. Indigenous people only consuming ayahuasca outside the confines of institutional religion where only the shamans are consuming the ayahuasca. Colonizers, Christian colonizers, were aware of ayahuasca and often persecuted the indigenous for it, so the indigenous just said, well, we can either stop doing ayahuasca or we can do it and hide it from you. And that's exactly what they did. And so for most of colonial period, the majority, the overwhelming, almost all of the consumption of ayahuasca was hidden from the colonial powers, was hidden from people who were not in the jungle. That changed in the 1900s. In the 1900s, two men with very similar backgrounds, for the same reasons, they entered the jungle. They lived in major Brazilian cities, Raimundo Iranusera and Gabriel da Costa. Sorry, I'm having a pop-up on this screen. I didn't know if it was there or not. My apologies. So these two men separately, one in the 1930s, one in the 1950s or 60s, forgive me, they enter the jungle because they go into the jungle for work. They're in the cities, they go into the jungle for work, and in the jungle, they consume ayahuasca. And this is important because these two men, again, independently of each other, they're both Catholics. And Catholics believe in Jesus, believe in God, believe in the saints, and they believe in the Virgin Mary. And so when these men saw the alleged feminine spirit of ayahuasca, they equated it with the Virgin Mary. And so what's fascinating is that these two Catholic men believed that they drank ayahuasca to access the Christian God, or the realm controlled by the Christian God, in addition to these other realms and whatnot. So they return from the jungle, they go back to their major cities in Brazil, and independently of one another, they create the first two ayahuasca churches. One creates a community called Santo Daime. The other creates the community UDV, União do Vegetal, meaning Union of the Plants. And so what's fascinating about these two groups is that since these men were Catholics, they had the institutional model of religion in mind. They know what Christian churches look like, with hierarchies and Sunday schools and special religious attire and holidays and whatnot. So when they created the first couple ayahuasca churches, there were others, but these are the first two major ones. When they created these ayahuasca churches, they created it with Christianity as a template for their new religions that they're creating. So they're basically creating two Catholic Christian versions of ayahuasca consumption. So these churches, along with at least one other, continue to exist in Brazil. They continue to exist in Brazil today. But fast forwarding to the 1980s, and two Americans get involved with this. And this is where we make the bridge to the United States. Jonathan Goldman from Oregon, he goes down to Brazil and drinks ayahuasca and becomes not only familiar with the Santo Daime community, but he becomes a member of the Santo Daime community. Independently, a man named Jeffrey Bronfman, he goes down to Brazil. He drinks ayahuasca. They call it huasca. Either way, Santo Daime calls it daime. Again, it has many different names. Jeffrey Bronfman drinks ayahuasca with the UDV. He becomes a member of the UDV. He's from New Mexico. So now we have two Americans who are both members of these ayahuasca religions in Brazil, and the important piece is they receive permission to bring it to North America. They receive permission to bring their respective churches to their communities. And that's exactly what they do. In the early 1990s, Jonathan Goldman brings Santo Daime to Oregon. Jeffrey Bronfman brings the UDV to New Mexico. Now, these people are operating largely independently of each other. The two communities have a lot in common, but they'll be the first to admit that they beef a lot. And so they know that each other was there. They operate independently of each other. But in one of these coincidences that they say are not a coincidence, they say that what I'm about to describe to you is not a coincidence, that Mother Ayahuasca was behind this. So either way, what happens? They are simultaneously in 1999 importing batches of ayahuasca. That's ayahuasca, I forget what format it was in. And so this was 1999, no one knew what ayahuasca was. Today, Aaron Rodgers and Will Smith, odds are your favorite celebrity has consumed ayahuasca. But that wasn't the case in 1999. So customs agents test this stuff, and they realize, oh, we've got big vats of DMT here. Their logic they're probably thinking is we just intercepted some vats of drugs that are destined for drug dealers. Let's go arrest them. And so they receive search warrants. They execute the search warrant on Jonathan Goldman. Jonathan Goldman is not home when the police or when the law enforcement executes the search warrant. The previous day, someone in his community had died from complications related to HIV/AIDS. And so while he is administering last rites to this member of his community, the police are raiding his home and handcuffing his children and holding them at gunpoint. Jonathan Goldman gets home to see this happening. Jonathan Goldman is arrested. Simultaneously, they execute a search warrant on Jeffrey Bronfman. Jeffrey Bronfman's not arrested, however. They catch him dead to rights with the ayahuasca. So law enforcement has never told us why they didn't arrest Jeffrey Bronfman, but the speculation, and it's a largely accepted truth, even though Bronfman has not commented on this publicly, but Jeffrey Bronfman is one of the heirs to the Seagram's fortune. So the Seagram's the Bronfman family from Canada has a net worth in the billions of dollars. So Jeffrey Bronfman doesn't give public interviews. He doesn't talk about this, so he has never confirmed that he was the one funding his church's subsequent legal situation. But presumably, he was not arrested because he had money and the means to fight the government. And so that's exactly what he did. Within a couple days, he retained a lawyer named Nancy Hollander. And Nancy Hollander agreed to meet with the FBI. She arranged a meeting with them. My apologies, it might have been the Department of Justice, one of those two. And I forget which branch officially was in charge of it. But Nancy Hollander goes into that meeting prepared to argue two things. One, that this is legitimate religion, right? That's what I'm channeling her argument. Think what you want to think. And her argument was this is legitimate religion. The FBI or the government's probably not going to recognize it as such, so we need to be ready to argue that it's legitimate religion. And two, that because of religious freedom laws, my clients, the UDV, have a right to import and consume this. No one else has that right, but my client, the religious community, has that right. So she goes into the meeting, and very soon, the government's lawyers say, we recognize that you're a religion. This was huge. It was also pretty predictable. Why? Because again, the UDV models itself as a Christian community. The UDV formed a church, holidays, they call ayahuasca a sacrament, a Christian concept. They're quite literally worshiping, in many ways, this Christian God. In other words, they presented themselves as a model of religion that the United States government recognizes. So this is important because let's start briefly to get into some of the theoretical stuff real quick. Scholars have repeatedly argued that because we're primarily a Christian country, that because of the history of Christian dominance in the United States jurisprudence system, that when the courts evaluate if something is a religion or not, what they're really doing is comparing it to Christianity, and more specifically to Protestant Christianity. That in the mind of the government, in the mind of the courts, that if you come and you say, I'm a religion, and you're not already recognized as a religion, there's a Christian model of what counts as religion that's kind of built into the system. And again, the UDV kind of fit this model. So the FBI says, we recognize you're a religion, but hashtag drug war, no, you don't get to do this. And so the UDV said, well, actually we do. And so the UDV sued. Their case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court decided in 2006. So the Supreme Court is hearing an argument. We have this religion. Everyone agrees they're a religion.
They are asking for that exemption that I mentioned earlier from the Controlled Substances Act that would allow them and them only to legally import and consume ayahuasca. So I'm curious, show of hands, how many people think that UDV won? How many people think the government said no? How many people didn't vote? Suspense. It was a unanimous decision in favor of the UDV. The court sided with the UDV, meaning that the UDV can now legally import and consume ayahuasca within their religious ceremonies. So to say that this was anything short of huge is an understatement. Again, for better or worse, you make your own judgment. What about our friend Jonathan Goldman? Jonathan Goldman was arrested, I believe, for one night. They let him go under the assumption that we're going to let you go because we get this as your religion. We're not going to press charges, but if you continue to hold these ceremonies, we're going to press charges. Well, he continued to hold the ceremonies. He just did it underground. But based on that decision, he hired his own lawyer, and in 2009, Santo Daime got their decision in Oregon in a court that they are now the second ayahuasca community that is fully legal. Since then, 3 additional ayahuasca communities have received this accommodation with the government. So, there are a total of 5 ayahuasca churches that are 100% legal today. Many churches have their paperwork in process to see if they're going to be the next. We'll see how that plan pans out. So, as I mentioned earlier, today there are potentially over 500 psychedelic churches. And almost all of them that I've interviewed, and I haven't interviewed anywhere near 500, but almost all of them that I've interviewed, they say we absolutely want to be fully legal. We are tired of operating as drug dealers. We are authentic religious Americans who are entitled to the right of religious freedom, they argue. And so my question is always, well, why don't you sue the government? And their answer is always pretty simple, are you going to pay for it? And it costs a lot of money. The Church of the Eagle and Condor, they're the third church there. When their lawyers submitted their bill and keep in mind, the Church of the Eagle and Condor, based on those 2 previous cases, they didn't even go to court. The FBI just negotiated with them and said, fine, we know we're going to lose. You can have your exemption. When their lawyers submitted their bill, it was $2.1 million. Maybe it was 2.2. And so to take on the United States government, to take on the entity that literally creates the money, is an expensive endeavor. And so the main reason that these churches don't want to, they're reluctant to do the legal fight is they simply don't have the money for it. But they have other problems as well. Keep in mind that they are almost consistently inspired by indigenous practices that don't resemble institutionalized religion. For example, traditional psilocybin psychedelic mushroom usage happens informally, so to speak, outside institutional churches. Peyote, the psychoactive cactus that Native Americans consume, some of them. Again, they've been doing it for a long time, but not in what we recognize as churches. We've already recognized ayahuasca is not consumed in ways, in the Amazon, it's not consumed in ways that resemble institutionalized church, institutionalized religion, as the United States recognizes it. So, the few people that I've interviewed that actually have gone to say we're going to approach the government, they've first gone to lawyers. And they have told the lawyers, listen, we recognize that what we're doing is probably not religion as the government recognizes it. So mold us. Tell us what we have to do. Tell us what we should do. Tell us what we shouldn't do. And tell us what we cannot do. Basically, tell us the template for how we get to have religious freedom. And so these lawyers know, there are 2 pieces to this. These lawyers know what the government is typically looking for when they decide if something is a religion or not. As scholars, and now us, as all scholars of religion, we now know that that template the government uses is influenced by Christianity. So with that in mind, I want to look at just 3 quick examples of the way Christianity becomes the template for all of religion. One example is, we got ahead of ourselves. In 1965, the United States Supreme Court tried to define all of religion. They were presented with something that is not typically recognized as religion in the United States. And so the court had to say, there's no legal definition of religion. We guarantee religious freedom, but we don't define it. And so the Supreme Court said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to define it. To define what all of religion is, we're going to quote a Christian and say that religion is about ultimate concern. And so, again, we could get into this in the discussion section if we have time, but not all of religion is about ultimate concern. And ultimate concern is a concern of people that don't have religion. So this may or may not be a good definition for Christianity, but it's not a good way to approach all of religion. An additional way that you see the template of Christianity becoming the model of what the government looks for when they adjudicate religion. Remember how I said you could go to the IRS to get recognition as a church? So the IRS quite literally has a 14-point checklist that they use. And so what is the 14 points? Do you have Sunday school? Do you have preparation of your members? Do you have ordained ministers? Do you have your literature, places of worship, congregations, regular church services, formal code of doctrine, etc., etc., etc.? So quite literally, Protestant Christianity or Christianity is the template for what the IRS uses. Another way where we can see this is one more court case in 1995, U.S. v. Myers, another case involving religion, where the court said, we don't really know what religion is, but here are the following things we look for. We look for, do you have ultimate ideas, metaphysical beliefs, moral or ethical systems? Do you have a founder, important writings? Again, Christianity, Christianity, Christianity. So, long story short, the people that I study, they go to lawyers, or at least the people that are trying to be legal, they go to lawyers and they say, we're starting with this, and we need you to make us this. We're starting with these indigenous practices that we kind of get don't resemble religion as is practiced in the United States. But basically, tell us how to earn religious freedom in this country. Tell us who to ask, on what terms. Again, tell us what to do, tell us what not to do, tell us what we shouldn't do, tell us what we can't. And so, with this in mind, an entire industry has emerged in the United States where lawyers are now creating how-to guides for these churches. And so I just want to look at 3 of them. One of them is an attorney named Gary Michael Smith. I forget what kind of law he does. It's like maritime law or something. But he's also a member of the Peyote Way Church of God. He is their general counsel. And because this interest in psychedelic churches is growing, he wrote a how-to manual called Psychedelics, the Law of Psychedelics. Another lawyer that is very active in this space is a woman named Allison Hoots. She is an independent lawyer. She is also a member of Chacuna. Chacuna is a psychedelic plant activist organization. And Allison Hoots is the primary author of Chacuna's How to Form a Church Guide. The third and final one I want to look at is an attorney named George Greg Lake. Greg Lake is important for many reasons. He has personally helped form over 70 entheogenic churches. And to help his clients, he published 2 books, The Law of Entheogenic Churches, Volume 1 and 2. And so when we look in his book, what do we see? A quite literal step-by-step guide of how to make your psychedelic church look Christian. And so what do we see? We see you got to have a statement of beliefs. It has to address ultimate ideas. It has to address metaphysical beliefs. Basically, the Myers factors are the template for how he helps people create churches. So, summing this up to leave some time for discussion. These lawyers, even if they don't have the language that I do, they understand the tension that I'm getting at here. The government and courts use Christian models of religiosity to evaluate the religiosity of non-Christian groups. To qualify for religious freedom, these lawyers understand you can't do anything they want. You have to look certain ways, you have to act certain ways, you have to conform your behavior. So, as I mentioned earlier, what I'm ultimately interested in is finding some of the contradictions in religious freedom. And as I hope to have demonstrated today, religious freedom laws do not systematically empower religion. Quite the contrary. Religious freedom laws in the United States restrict freedom. They coerce people into behaving, acting, and even thinking in ways they do not desire. In short, religious freedom exists, but as evidenced by this talk, only for those people who surrender their ability to express their religiosity on their terms. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
Well, you're saying that they don't really allow for religious freedom, but at the same time, do you personally think that religious freedom is something to search for in the context of then allowing for religious communities to break laws?
Can you repeat the last part?
So, like, would you think that religious freedom is something to work towards in this context? Would it entail that these communities
is a longer precedent in the United States. Okay, there are things called generally applicable laws. All right? Generally applicable laws are laws we all have to follow. We all have to stop at stop signs. We all have to pay taxes. Sometimes our religions tell us to break those laws. Okay? And so there is a larger history in the United States already of the government allowing religious people to break otherwise generally applicable laws. That's already the precedent. So the question isn't, you know, let me put it this way. When I gave a version of this talk in Belgium, no one said, not one person, not one student raised their hand and said, religious people should be exempt from the laws. Like, it was part of their cultural understanding. Religious people have to follow the laws. I gave a version of this talk in the United States, and we're much more open to the idea that, yeah, sometimes religious people get to break the laws. And so, as a scholar, I'm not going to try to say what I think the ideal is. I'm just going to point out there is a larger history of religious people breaking laws in the U.S. with the government's approval. It's not a question of if they get to it. It's a question of how broadly religious people are allowed to break otherwise generally applicable laws. You cool with that answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You said that the people who are striving for religious freedom are like trying to move into like
Yeah.
Christian religion or about something that's trying for that to be able to like get drugs and stuff. So is that really that freedom if they're actually incorporating more rights just already instead of beliefs in order just as people do something illegal and then
That's the point of my lecture. They have the freedom to conform to maybe be legal. It's an irresolvable tension, is what I'm saying. You're not happy with that answer.
No, I just think that like it's not freedom because
Okay.
they're going completely against freedom, like conforming to something that they don't actually believe in. Like they don't want to like have this idea of having to be like churches, Protestant church, yet they're doing that simply for the means of freedom in the terms of just moving like without church. So like it's an excuse that there's no freedom and an excuse. And that's how the way to
All set? Back.
Would you say that it's disrespectful almost to like the native religious people use psychedelics and then conforming their experience to Christian church or institution style?
You've tapped on a paper. Could you repeat the question? Sure. And tell me if I'm getting your question correctly. Is it disrespectful to the indigenous, given our long history of oppressing the indigenous? Is it disrespectful to the indigenous to alter their traditional practices?
Yes.
That's your question?
And then turn it into a Christianized religious experience.
Okay, so you're highlighting a tension that there's a paper percolating that I want to write that I haven't written yet that addresses just that topic. So in the psychedelic renaissance, one of the important components of the psychedelic renaissance is showing respect to indigenous traditions and making sure that what you're doing has a lineage, not just kind of making stuff up as you go. And as we kind of saw today, that if you stand a chance of being legal, you have to alter these indigenous practices. And so again, this is one of those, I'm going to argue, irresolvable tensions, that by trying to honor the indigenous practices as we bring them here, the legal system is forcing them to change in a way that arguably dishonors their tradition itself. Yeah. Let me check on this side. Yes.
So, as a follow-on to that, so Native American Indians on a reservation, which technically are a separate nation and have a separate, some separate laws, do they have more ability to practice those indigenous rights?
Native Americans, because of an act of Congress, Native Americans have the right to consume traditional sacraments for religious purposes. Full stop.
They don't need a church designation
For religious reasons. Because of the unique aspect of Native Americans, a different standard applies. Yeah, great question. Yes.
Do you think the increased prevalency of these churches in America has shifted the general perspective of how drugs are utilized?
Not yet, but it's coming. It's coming. Again, the fact that we've gone from about 5 psychedelic churches to potentially 500 in about 15 years, I mean, the future's pretty high. No disrespect to the people I study. This isn't stopping anytime soon. Yeah, so I think the change is yet to come. Here, excuse me, Professor.
It seems to me, I apologize, I'm going to get into the weeds with that. It seems to me that with the UDV decision, the floodgate was open because the material was being imported, so it was a federal standard rather than a state standard. I'm wondering if you can talk first about whether these attorneys are telling people to import the mushrooms, you'll be better off, but also what that means in terms of the difference between the Religious Freedom Restoration Act before and after the decision.
Yeah, okay, so how can I answer that in a way that does honor to the weediness of your, no pun intended, of your question without going too deep in the weeds? No pun intended. If we have an hour, right? No, I'm joking. Let me put it this way. 2 mushroom churches, the courts have ruled in their favor. And one in Oregon, no, one in New Hampshire, and one in Utah, of all places. And they haven't appealed to the federal RFRA. In New Hampshire, they appealed to the state constitution. And in Utah, they appealed to the state constitution, the state RFRA, and the federal RFRA. And so the layer of law that you're prosecuted with will impact which of those, is the federal law coming after you or is the state coming after you? Because in Utah, the police showed up to arrest them. So that triggered the state stuff. Is that cool?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have time for one more question?
So some of these they're conforming to Christian, right? Are people actually completely changing their structure of their institution, or are they just doing it on the surface and then do whatever they want?
Oh, they are walking the walk.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's just complete change.
Complete change. Because they know that we can have Sunday school or we can go to prison. And even if we have Sunday school, we might go to prison. So they're walking the walk. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming out today. I know it's going to be around for a few minutes if you have other questions. I do want to encourage you, 12 days from today, today we talked about drugs, 12 days from today we're talking about sex. And it is really, as we learn about sex, what that tells us about religion and race. Next Thursday, a dream deferred. Don't know anything about that celebration of Black excellence. It's going to be in the evening over there. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.